In this video, I'd like to discuss chapters 8 through 9 of J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. And since this is part 6 of our video series, you probably want to watch some of the previous videos to get a sense of what's going on here. Now, at this point in the book, to give you at least a little bit of context, Austin is starting over. He has found that his initial distinction between what he called constatives, so descriptive statements, constatives, and performatives, this contrast has broken down. He hasn't been able to find any real law of grammar or syntax or whatever to ultimately distinguish them. And what he has increasingly found is that one statement, one sentence, can do multiple things at once. In one context, it can be constative. In another, it can be performative. And so increasingly, what Austin is saying is that instead of trying to separate these so that we put them kind of side by side and we say, well, here's a constative sentence and here's a performative sentence, instead we can actually say, well, maybe this sentence, which looks constative, can at the same time be performative. And that sense of one statement doing multiple things, that is what Austin wants to really talk about at the end of his book. And the last number of chapters explore this new idea. And he starts off by arguing a few things just about the very basic nature of language. And so we have three statements here. And he says, one thing we can do is we can simply make a bunch of nonsense sounds, right? Like goo, dee, ah, woo. And we could say, well, this is kind of phonetic. We're making noises. We're just making a bunch of noises. The problem is that it tends towards nonsense. It doesn't really have any meaning for us. The next stage of making some sense of things is just on the level of vocab and grammar. Okay, so vocab and grammar. Barely fits there. So if we say, for instance, the cat is on the mat, if somebody says that, now we might be thinking of a specific cat, but if we report it in indirect speech, then we could say, well, he said the cat is on the mat, and now we're not making any claim about which cat that is, where that mat is. We're simply reporting a statement, and we're reporting a statement that has a certain vocab and grammar. It follows the rules of language to some extent, and Austin calls this a phatic statement. So we're not dealing yet with a really context-dependent statement, with something that makes sense in our immediate surroundings, let's say, but we're just reporting something that on a certain level works in terms of its vocab and grammar. As soon as we move to a more specific context, and we're starting to talk about things like meaning and reference, so at this point we're saying, well, there has to be a cat we're actually talking about, and there has to be a mat, then he calls this the Retic level of language. And you can see that these two levels here, the cat is on the mat in indirect speech, and this more specific statement where it makes sense in its immediate context, these statements are the same, but they become more and more specific. And that's the thing to take away from this initial kind of discussion of language. That if we think about language, we can distinguish between what we might call meaning and use. In other words, there can be meaning on a number of different levels, right? This is just a meaning here that has to do with vocab and grammar, whereas the second one is a more specific meaning that has to do with maybe my cat Fluffy, let's say. And then we can also think about use, and use changes depending on context as well. So he said the cat is on the mat. That might be a totally different cat, totally different mat. He may be doing something very different by saying that. He may be trying to persuade me that I need to kick the cat off the mat because he's just about to pee on it or who knows what. And the last statement is a very different statement. It all really depends on context. Now, one of the problems is that it seems like meaning changes depending on how you use a particular statement. And this is something that bugs Austin throughout these chapters, the sense of, can meaning be stable? Can meaning and use be stable, or are these things interchangeable? How do we distinguish between these things? And one of the reasons why Austin is so concerned about this distinction is because meaning ultimately goes back to this constitutive statement, right? It just means something, and use seems to have more to do with the performative. And that's why even at this stage, Austin is trying to keep them somewhat separate, but they tend to run into each other quite a lot. Okay, so what we've seen then is that at the very basic level of language, as we think about how we make meaning, we do see that statements tend in two directions. On the one hand, they tend towards nonsense, if we don't have some kind of context to make sense of them. And on the other hand, they tend towards what he calls vagueness. So if you say this in a particular context, well, the implication is that the meaning of cat can change a lot and is quite vague until you put a context with it. And that's the problem, is that we're constantly stuck between nonsense and vagueness, and that is obviously problematic. Okay, so now we get to really the core of these chapters, and this is the crucial distinction that if there's anything you take away from Austin's book, this is really the critical thing. He comes up with a new way then of categorizing statements, and the first thing he says is that a statement that seems to merely work on a kind of meaning level, on the level of, let's say, grammar and vocabulary and things like that, of reference and so on. This is what he calls a locutionary act. You could also just call it a locution, but we'll call it a locutionary act. And what we are doing here is we're basically just saying something that has a certain reference and meaning. And I've given a couple of examples here. So if you say shoot him, then on the level of meaning, there's got to be a him that we're talking about. Let's just say this is Bob. And shooting implies something as well. We know that it maybe implies pulling a trigger, right? So on the locutionary level here, we're just talking about meaning. Okay. The other example I have here is there is a bull. Well, we have to have some image of what a bull is. We might be pointing in some direction. So this is a locutionary act. And you can think of this as being on the level of the constitutive again. That this is descriptive kind of speech. The second level, and this is still the same statement, this is the illocutionary act. Illocutionary act. Now, what I've done here, and this is what Austin does as well, is he gives you a different form of the same statement, but he's not saying that this is a different statement. He's saying this is actually implicit. When you say shoot him, you might be meaning he urged me to shoot him. So just keep thinking of this statement here, shoot him, as what we're talking about. An illocutionary act then is where we are using our speech, but it has a kind of conventional force to it. It has a purpose to it, and we're doing an action by it. So we could call this the use of the sentence. Okay, it has a force, it has a use. Another way to think of this kind of statement is through the expression in saying X, we are doing something. Okay, so if you think of saying shoot him, then in saying shoot him, we are urging, there's the action, for somebody to shoot. And earlier he had called this the explicit performative, right? We make sure that we have this more explicit kind of statement at the beginning. But it's actually still the same sentence. And what we can see here now is that instead of separating the constitutive and the performative and saying these are very separate sentences and statements, what we're actually finding is that they are implicit in each other. A constitutive statement can at the very same time be a performative. And so statements have multiple levels at which they work. And that's really the finding of this book. You can see that also with there is a bull. And there is a bull might simply mean I warn you to run away, right? It's the same thing. This statement is implicit in our earlier statement, and this is simply the illocutionary level, but we're not distinguishing between them as very separate acts or statements. Then we have one more level, and this is what's called the perlocutionary level. Perlocutionary. And you can think of this first little bit, this prefix, as through or by. So by saying something, we do a follow-up kind of act. And think of these as consequential actions. So consequential actions. All right. These are effects that the statement has on the audience, and these effects can have to do with feelings, with thoughts, with actions. And so, for instance, if you say shoot him, then that means he urged me to shoot him. That's our illocutionary act. But it can have an effect, and then the effect is he persuaded me to shoot him. And so C1 is an effect that is probably more immediately intended, whereas C2 is a little bit more distant. So if we go down a little bit here, C2 is a bit more distant. He got me to shoot him, right? So if I say shoot him, I may not actually be completely sure that you're going to do this, and so C2 is a little bit more distant, or what Austin calls oblique. You can see this with the second example, and I've made this much more explicit here. You might, for instance, say, he made me scared when he said there's a bull, or he made me run, right? That's the consequential action of the speech act. Or even more unpredictably, I ran off a cliff. That's the follow-up action. Now, maybe that's what he meant to do, right? Maybe I was standing next to a cliff and there's a bull, or maybe there isn't even a bull, and he says, there is a bull, and he wanted me to panic and run off the cliff. I don't know. I mean, we don't always know. It depends on context. So in this case, this may be an intended action or an unintended action. But as you can see, perlocutionary acts are very unpredictable. We don't necessarily know what these follow-up actions are going to be. And these are the three levels then at which speech acts work. The very same statement can have multiple levels, and we have to learn to distinguish them, not by saying, well, this statement is consecutive and this is perlocutionary or this is illocutionary. Instead, what we're learning is that one single statement can have multiple levels, some of which can be performative.